Hello, hello.
Hello.
I feel like I haven't seen you in so long.
Hi, Vanessa. It's
It's
good to see you.
good to see you. We have a question to answer today. And the question is how to transition from romantic to platonic relationship. No drama, lots of love.
That's it. That's the question.
That's the question. So I guess my question, which we don't have this person here to ask, would be is the other person in alignment or not? So I guess we could answer this question in two ways.
Yeah. I think that's the question. Does the other person agree? Do you have their buy-in? If not, they're certainly the same. I don't know. I was about to say approach that you take either way, but it sounds like this person's pretty clear.
Hmm.
And there's something about saying no drama that makes me believe that somehow there's like a shared idea that
Yeah.
we've come to a culmination here.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
I think let's assume that they are in alignment. It sounds like maybe it's almost like waiting for the other person to go first, maybe. It just sounds like
hmm,
they're waiting on the other person to say it first, you know? And how do you be the first one to go? And I guess that could pertain to anything. How do you be the first one to say the hard thing in
yeah.
any situation, you know?
So funny. I was just doing an interview where we were talking about breakups, and um, the person was asking me, "Do you think it's harder for the person that is the breakupee or the
Mhm.
breakuper?" And I was like, "I honestly think." I don't think it's harder or easier for either person, but I don't think people honor the person that does the deed enough. Like, I think
Totally.
that person gets a lot of flack, becomes like villainized. I
Mhm.
think quite often we don't societally take into account the amount of courage it takes to be the one to finally pull the plug on something that has expired. And so I think, yeah, that person is also going through a breakup just as much as the other person, but they have to carry the additional weight of being the bad guy.
I love that. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I know that I feel like if I'm thinking personally, like my MO almost is to be the one that like pushes the other person to do it first.
Mm,
And then like the one time in my life that I had to like be the one to do it because I knew the other person wouldn't do it, but I knew that we both knew that it needed to happen
yeah.
was probably like the hardest thing I've ever had to do, you know? Even though I was so clear, it was still so hard. Um, and I mean, it's still hard actually, even
Mm,
now. Like it's still, I was actually just talking to a client about this, about how, you know, and you and I have talked about this, like this lesson that we learn, hopefully, around being the bad guy
mhm,
in somebody else's story, even if that's not your truth, right?
mhm,
And how much work it takes to like be okay with that. Or even maybe not the bad guy, but even if like that person's narrative of what happened is different than the way you see it, and being okay with like you're never going to be able to convince them otherwise, or maybe there's just not an opportunity to convince them otherwise. And can you be okay with just knowing your truth,
mhm.
even if that other person and potentially even multiple people don't know your truth, don't care to know your truth, don't believe your truth? It's hard.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point in the context of what that person was asking, which is like no drama, even if it's sort of an amicable breakup. I think what I find to be often the most challenging aspect of breakups are other people's perspectives, point of views, um, other people having like, they're mad at your person or whatever, like they don't know how to interact with the two of you anymore because you're not a couple, and that can be sort of challenging waters to navigate. And I think if you guys are on the same page, I think what a lot of times our work in terms of what we need to prepare for, the conversations we need to have, is like, how are we going to hold this for other people when they are
Mm.
activated? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I love
I
that. Say more.
remember well, I remember when my marriage ended, people being like, "Oh my god, we're so sorry," and us being like, "We're not."
We're not.
It's like nobody's dying. Like we're actually in a really good place. This is a good thing, people.
Yep.
Like, but we're just so conditioned to think of breakups as like a horrific thing. And that was another thing I was just talking about. A lot of times when people actually break up, right? Like I think I heard this thing that's like normally 4 to 5 cycles of like we break it up and get back together, or like on average, or like we attempt to break up and it doesn't stick or whatever it is. So when someone finally reaches that point, or 2 people reach that point of like we're done, a lot of times it's like it's been exhausting. I think Glennon Doyle speaks to that a little bit as well. Like we don't celebrate the like you don't have to be in the struggle anymore with
Mm,
people that a lot of times people actually really do feel. And I think that's true of various forms of grief. Like I felt that when my dad passed away. Like my dad doesn't have to suffer anymore and there was like relief. And I think sometimes when we've been going through something really challenging, like a relationship that's not working, there's such a deep sense of exhale,
whew.
and I don't have to do this anymore. And I just get to be free of that inner turmoil that I rarely hear people talk about, but I think is often the case, you know?
Well, I think we feel guilty for that. Like, I
Mm.
think, because society makes us feel like breakups are the worst thing, right? Because there's nothing worse than not being partnered, right? In our
Mhm.
society. I think because the society makes us feel so bad about that, um, it's hard for people to admit that a breakup is actually a good thing or a release or a relief, right? Because I know when I ended that relationship I was talking about, I remember having a moment, I don't know, maybe like 6 months after the fact, where I was kind of sitting by myself reflecting, and I had this like, oh, I haven't cried. Like, I actually
Mm.
have not cried one time since I left. And I immediately felt some sort of like guilt about that, or maybe a little shame. I don't know. And then as soon as I started feeling guilty, I had this other thought that came in. It was like, yeah, but you did a lot of crying in the last year to 2 years of that relationship. And so
Yeah.
what I think we don't talk about enough is like, you do the grieving work just because for some people, right? Like if you don't cry, if you're like me, it's not because I wasn't sad or wasn't grieving. It's because I had been doing the grieving within the container. And I think sometimes it goes the same for when people die. I mean, I know when my grandma passed away, again, like I cried maybe once or twice, and she was a really important person in my life, but I think I had grieved it before she had passed. Of
Mm.
course I was sad, but it just was different. And I think we feel guilty for processing it in that way, and I don't think we should.
Yeah. I think there's room to normalize that whatever's coming up is okay and
Mhm.
you feel how you feel. And I think it is actually not only often a really normal thing for you to feel a sense of deep relief after with what you're speaking to. I've sort of been in this struggle
Mhm.
of this, grieving this for a while. But I think also, especially if, as the person asking this question is saying, we're in a pretty good place,
Yep.
I think like happy and excited.
Yeah.
And we're actually like, better together
Mhm.
because I feel like I felt very alienated in that experience. And granted, it was like my kid's dead. So we still had to interact with one another a lot. But like, yeah, I mean, there were moments that were challenging, but for the most part, we were kind of excited to like
Mhm.
not be in that container anymore. And so I love to tell people all the time the beautiful thing about a breakup is you can go anywhere, you can do
Mm.
anything. Now, if you have kids, maybe not, but for the most part, a breakup is like a new opportunity. I remember this girl in college who was like so enmeshed with her boyfriend and they broke up. And it was like, at first, she was like devastated, but then she was like, I was talking to her about it and she was like, the world is my oyster, though.
Mm.
Like, all of a sudden, I realized there's all these things that I was into doing that he didn't want to do, these places I want to travel, and I'm going. And I was like, whoa, that's what's cool. Like now all
Yeah.
of a sudden your life belongs to you again. And not that it shouldn't have while you were in that relationship, but a lot of times we have to take that other person into account when we're
Mhm.
making decisions, where when we're single, all of a sudden it's like sky's the limit, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think something is coming up too around what you said around, what other people think and, like, how other people view you, and I think sometimes, um, when you're in a place of knowing this topic I feel like has been really present lately around people asking the question around, like, "How do I know?" And, like, "When is it time to act?" And, like, "When do I just do the thing?" Regardless of whether we're talking relationships or not, you know? And, I feel like
Mm.
I've said a lot, and I know you say something similar, which is, like, "When you know, you'll know." and we don't have to push ourselves into a place of knowing. We have to trust that when our inner self, when our intuition, when our soul knows something, it will be a knowing, right? And we'll
Mm,
be very good in our knowing. And I just lost where I was going with that, but I I just think that that is something too that we don't need to beat ourselves up for, that we also don't have to explain to other people. I think a lot of times, especially in breakups, people wanna know all the details. They wanna know the why, they wanna know the how, they wanna meanwhile, you've been in it with this person, I'm sure, going around and around for a while, and you don't really owe anybody else an explanation. You don't really owe anybody a
mm,
justification. And I think where I was going with that is, like, that inner knowing, we have to keep coming back to that, because I do think sometimes other people's feelings about us and our decisions can make us waver. Not
mm.
always, but I have seen it happen. And so we need to be really kind of coming back to ourselves continuously in our knowing, so that we don't get like knocked off course by those around us who, I'm sure have good intentions at heart, but um, aren't us. They're not
Yeah.
us. They don't have our knowing.
Something you said that I just love so much is like my inner knowing is enough because I
Hmm.
think there's a way that societally that is so unacceptable. Like, if you are in a relationship with a good person and
Mm.
there's nothing wrong and they're not like abusive, then why would you leave? Right? Like, why would you not stay in this relationship container? And something John certainly has normalized is the idea that some relationships are meant to expire. And
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that those people don't still have an incredible amount of love and respect for one another, but it means I believe that the point of relationships and why we join together in partnership with another person is because we have a shared vision of what our relationship should look like and what we want to
Hmm.
build together. And sometimes we do have that at one point,
Hmm.
and then people evolve and they change, and that's not true anymore. And I think we really need to societally evolve into not villainizing people for that, and that
Yeah.
sometimes there is no reason except the vision isn't the same anymore. And we have so much love for each other and we're just not headed in the same direction.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also if we looked at our relationships more as like, it doesn't actually matter if it's a romantic partnership, if it's a friendship, if it's a, family relationship, that really doesn't matter. I mean, if we're looking at all relationships in our lives as, are we in alignment? Are we acting from a place of love? What would love look like? Um, I feel like we would be in a lot less struggle in general around like
Mm,
attempting to kind of like stranglehold relationships, and like make them be something they're not, right? Versus
mm,
just like allowing relationships to kind of be the like living, breathing entities that they already are. And living organisms change, and like you said, they evolve, and there's death and rebirth. And I think a lot of times, and I've seen this with clients, and I think I would probably say I've seen it in myself, we actually hinder our growth sometimes. Like, we keep ourselves stunted by keeping ourselves attached to relationships that no longer are in alignment with us.
mhm.
And I don't think, I mean, I feel like our soul's purpose is to evolve. That's why we're here. And so if I'm holding on to, out of fear, anybody, again, romantic or otherwise, that's actually keeping me from evolving, then I'm not doing myself or that other person's soul any favors?
Yes. Yeah. I think it is exciting to be alive at a time where not only are we starting to conceptualize love and relationships in a different way, but that we have the freedom and the opportunity to do that. I think
Mm,
as women, certainly our ancestors are looking at us with the ability to make these choices for ourselves and are just beaming, I
yeah.
believe, because there was a very long time where it didn't matter if you guys were not in alignment or on the same page. Like, it was like, sister,
Didn't matter if you were getting your
this
ass beat, literally. Didn't
yeah, I
matter.
mean, absolutely, for so many reasons, and listen, in some places that aren't like what, no fault divorce states, like, that's still
Still the
a
case.
fight that
A lot of
women
places in the world too, outside of our country.
absolutely, and I think as we have these conversations, it's really important to bring that into the conversation as well, that some of that is a really privileged space to be able to
Mhm.
stand in. But because we have that um, opportunity, I think it's important to really be in the space of like fighting for truth and, like you said, our
Mhm.
inner knowing, because that hasn't always been something that women and people in general were able to have for themselves.
Yeah, and I think I wanna also just circle back to the word platonic that this person used, like from romantic to platonic, because
Hmm.
I also think that and I've been a believer of this for a long time, like long before I kind of got into this space, but ending relationships doesn't mean or ending the way that a relationship looks, changing. How about changing the way a relationship looks or changing a container does not actually have to mean that you hate each other. And
Oh
I
my
think
gosh.
so often I have seen, obviously, you have a very personal experience with this. And I just feel like so often I've seen in so many people, I have one ex included, that they have to hate that person. It's like if they don't hate that person, they won't have a reason to blame them. They won't have a reason to I mean, I guess kind of stay the victim, but for some people I think having like hatred is like a way that they're able to move forward and move on. And I think also when we're talking about like rewriting what we're allowed to do in relationships and end in relationships, I think that's also part of it. Like we don't have to hate each other. We can, and I've said this to clients, I'm like, are we holding on to something until we hate each other because then it's easier to let go of? Because you don't have to do that. You get to decide to say there's no one at fault here. We want to stay friends, platonic, and that's how we're going to end this versus we're going to keep a stranglehold until we hate each other's guts and we have no other option but to leave.
Well, I think that's you brought up 2 points that I think are
Mhm.
so important, and I think the thing of, like, I have to hate this person or I have to, um, have, like, this thing of being in love with this person, to me is just another example of the ways that we are conditioned to dehumanize one another, and I've always found it fascinating, like, when people get divorced, I would be like, "Where does the love go?" Like, you
Yeah,
loved someone enough to, like, share your life with them and now
I
you
know.
hate them?
I know.
Fascinating, right? Um, but I think that that is like, if you are the object, and you know how I feel about this, that I am getting my needs met through, then you're acceptable to be here. Then you are what, like your utility that I'm finding like use in, right? Um, and if not, then I'm done with this
Mm,
transaction and you're dead to me. But
mm,
that is like, we can't speak, or excuse me, we can't hold space for the complexity of emotions that, like, it's like what we often talk about, and I don't want to genderize it, but because I think this is true of all genders, but I think certainly with men, we talk a lot about how men are socialized to only be able to experience emotions through anger and sex. And I think it's either you're like this sexual object that I like have desire for, or I hate you. And that's so much
mhm.
of like the conditioning coming into play in our relationships. Um, there was another thing you brought up that I can't remember now.
Yeah. I don't know, y'all. It's like we get to choose. I just feel like I've said this so many times to so many clients. Like, who says? Who says? We get to
Oh,
decide.
that was the other thing you said. I think that to me, like, you know how you were saying, like, we often speak to, and I think when we facilitate groups, we talk about, like, when like, you
Mhm.
just have this internal knowing. And while I do think that's true, what I was talking to a client about the other day is I do think we know, and like, the fear keeps us holding on, and then we get to this point of destroying each other,
Mm.
and, like, we can't be friends anymore because we've just, like, picked apart at
Yeah,
anything that was good and right and true about our dynamic, and that, I think, is sometimes the reason to not let it get to that space, not
I
get it
agree.
to the space where, like, I don't even, like, respect you anymore because we've just picked apart so much at, again, one another's humanity.
Oh, I agree. I agree. I caught myself. I remember saying when I was leaving that relationship, I remember saying to a friend, and it's like saying this out loud now, just I mean, my eyes are wide just thinking about saying this, but I remember saying to a friend, I wish he had hit me
Mm.
because this would be easier. Like this decision to leave would be easier.
Oof.
And I mean, I have a lot of compassion for that version of myself then, but
Yeah.
listen, I mean, these decisions are hard when somebody else is involved. It's very rarely is it like easy peasy, I mean, it's always going to be a struggle, but I have compassion for that version of myself who just really felt like I needed a reason that was that big to just choose myself and say this isn't in alignment and I love you and this is no fault, but it's not in alignment for me anymore. And by the way, for this person either. I mean, like Glennon Doyle always says, there's no such thing as one-way liberation, right? Um, but I felt somehow like I needed that kind of justification for it to be okay. And
Yes.
I don't believe that now, but boy, I believed it then. And I know a lot of people do. And I've heard something similar to that come from a lot of people's mouths. So I know that I'm not the only one. But um, yeah, that's just a whole other paradigm that we need to shift.
Yeah, you're far from the only one, and I think that circles back to that thing of, like, you need to have a reason,
Hmm.
otherwise, why would you end
Yep.
this? Which is why, the obsession of my life is that I believe we are evolving beyond these ownership templates where, like, every day we should be making a conscious choice from the space of we don't belong to one another. So
Mm,
if we're here, we are both choosing to be here because we want to be, not because anybody's entitled to our life. That's not, I believe, what it means to love one another,
yeah.
but that has been everything we have been programmed to believe up to this point is like, you belong to me once
Hmm.
you're my person. And I think a lot of times that can feel like a cage.
Yeah. We're evolving, y'all. Buckle up.
Hmm. Beautiful time to be alive.